Numerous late medieval patrons have themselves represented with rosary beads. Using them engages multiple senses. They are made out of unusual materials with specific tactile qualities, cool and crystalline stone, or warm amber with its gelatinous surface tension, or lightweight, brittle, and semi-porous coral that's carved out of bifurcating branches of something straddling categories of plant, animal, and mineral. Handmade, they are never perfectly radially symmetrical, and each individual bead offers up a unique microtopography to the inquisitive finger. They feel unlike anything else in the sensory environment, and they can often accompany frilly metalwork finials or silk tassels with their swish and swing. Displayed prominently, they're highly visible. Snaking on a chain, they interact with each other and with the fingers, engaging the sense of proprioception, that is, the sense of the body in space. They also have a temporal element since they're designed for counting, for marking time. They clink together, as you can hear. And as an attribute, rosary beads identify saints. As real-world objects, they give the pious something to do with their hands. They contribute to the devotio sensory world, and they provide a handful of familiar pleasure while raising the mind to the spiritual realm. Handling them might even be a conduit to piety. In this talk, I will look briefly at the symbolism of the rosary, consider the structure of the beads and the prayers that they accompany, then employ use-wear analysis to consider how two particular rosary manuscripts were handled. One is now in Brussels and the other in London. And I'll ask how exactly the images functioned for their early users. Finally, I'll consider why, cognitively, the rosary became so desirable in the years just before the Reformation. Beyond serving as a desirable and collectible item, what was the devotional purpose of the rosary that blossomed to serve it? There's evidence that simply positioning the body in a pious formation may actually lead to increased feelings of piety. Rosaries drape not only the body, but also the page, where they become charged ornamentation, filling the vague marginal landscape and swinging from niches. Coral beads had apotropaic attributes, and in these images one can see that the illuminator put them in the same cognitive category alongside crucifix jewelry, images of the face of Christ, and cut gemstones with their lapidary's array of health benefits. The border imagery of this little studied manuscript provides a narrative history of the origin of the rosary. It performs a backdrop for the rosary text, whose rubric announced, "Here begins Our Dear Lady's Golden Rosary." Angels harvest the living roses, then present them to the Christ child, who then gives them to his mother, who braids them into a chaplet, suggesting that the beads are like roses, which are transactional and penetrate the garden to go through Christ's body to reach the Virgin. One could compare that with this binding clasp, where one has to go through the garden of roses to gain entry into the prayer book inside the locked cover. The metalsmith's decorative framework itself presents a string of beads, and one can imagine allowing one's finger to linger before snapping the book open, only to reveal inside intensely patterned images depicting figures such as this Jerome, who lavishes fingery attention on his manuscript while seemingly staring into space. It's as if he's translating the book through his fingers onto the codex. Or one could compare it with this little-known black manuscript, in which beaded devotional jewelry and flowers form the background to a devotion based on Christ's fragmented and pierced body parts, where the wounds are represented as rosettes of blood. Not only are the wounds like flowers of flesh, but his body parts are punctured like beads. The very holes in the beads are on display in the rosary of this manuscript border, which Anna Margreet Asvijvers has written about. And one can imagine running them with one's fingers along the string, rolling them between the thumb and forefinger. The themes of beaded religious jewelry and enumerative prayer unite in this new iconography in a manuscript made in the eastern Netherlands, but's now in Wrocław. I have Camille Copania to thank for helping me gain access to the library to study this manuscript. The imagery combines the garden of prayer, devotion to the Virgin in Sole, and devotion to the wounds of Christ, where the free-floating hands and feet are pierced, thereby affording them the chance to serve as decade beads. The votary is invited to finger the perforated body parts as she progresses around the string of beads. Not only were rosary beads attributes for piety, but they could also signify the duration of prayer, that their possessor had prayed so many hundreds of Ave Marias and Paternosters, each bead clicking off a prayer like a spiritual odometer for an ephemeral and invisible activity. The abrasion on the beads themselves, especially if they're made from an organic material such as these bone beads, carved in the shapes of skulls and then strung neck to cranium, they will reveal those hours of piety. Extensive contact with the body results in a shiny hand polish, where surface detail has been polished away, eroded. The body shapes the beads, and the beads shape the body, tying the hands together in a prayerful position and encouraging long genuflections. Beads also shape the manuscript, moving out of the border and into the central image. The beads not only define the garden, but structure a new family of prayers, which rhyme structurally with the beads themselves. Namely, the new structure begins with an explanatory rubric, followed by 5 or sometimes 10 prayers to Mary, each punctuated with an Ave Maria. These are symbolized by the smaller beads. One recitation of the Paternoster is marked by a larger contrasting bead. This is precisely the structure of the beads represented in the border of the Vienna manuscript, and the cycle continues in a feedback loop in which prayer structures shape rosary beads, and rosary beads in turn give rise to new prayers with a particular enumerating structure. By 1500, there are several dozen different rosary texts, and these are, of course, increasing the demand for beads. The new generation of manuscripts containing rosary devotions, and these are largely made in the southern Netherlands in the decades flanking 1500, show their donors brandishing rosary beads. I want to suggest that not only did the devotion shape the beads and the beads shape the prayers, but that praying with the beads shaped how votaries interacted physically with their manuscripts. Rosary beads became a subject of manuscript illumination, as in the case of the Van Hoff prayer book, which has been discussed lucidly by Anna Margreet Asvijvers. It is as if the beads have leapt from the donor's belt onto the page, where the decade beads representing the Paternosters have swollen into thought bubbles containing the scenes from the infancy and passion. As the image makes clear, the beads provide a cognitive structure for imagining the life of Christ. Indeed, this extraordinary image prefaces a rosary devotion structured around 10 Ave Marias followed by a Paternoster. One can see by the heavy abrasion at the bottom and outer edges of these folios that the user read this text frequently, rubbing it with dry fingers as she held the book open. By following the dotted lines formed by the rosary beads, this practice combines following the enumerated prayers of the rosary with a station-based devotion associated with the Stations of the Cross or with paintings such as Memling's Turrent Passion. Another rosary manuscript presents this initial, depicting a woman with her rosary beads praying before an open book, which reflexively may refer to the very book in which the initial appears. In this short prayer book, the Rosary devotion again provides a cognitive scaffolding for encountering the Passion. Each segment begins with a narrative image in an historiated initial. It then has 5 short prayers, which each finishes with an Ave Maria. In the first initial or decade bead, the apostles who have fallen asleep while Christ prays in Gethsemane provide an object lesson in how not to pray. The structure continues with an image of Christ before Herod, and continuing with the flagellation and a carrying of the cross, and finishing with a crucifixion and an entombment, each filling a 4-line D. You will certainly have noticed the degree of abrasion on the initials. It is as if the donor treated the initials as beads to be fingered, as if to roll the scenes of the Passion over in her fingers and in her mind, to treat the initials as if they were strings of rosary beads. In other words, the beads and the manuscript not only reflexively structure one another, but the ritual practice of handling the beads spills into the practice of handling the rosary manuscript. This way of fingering the initials has carried into the rest of the brief manuscript, where the owner has particularly touched the face of Christ, prefacing the next text. The relationship between the hands and the painted parchment becomes even more palpable in my amateur photograph of this manuscript opening, where one can see that the scale of the initials and the damage is precisely the scale of the yearning finger. One can even see that the original owner was probably right-handed, and she stroked the images from lower left to upper right, pulling some of the loosened paint along with her, and even reshaping some of the burnished gold. Now, the fact that this image shows the face of Christ is especially interesting, considering that Morgan manuscript and the beads represented in the border, where the face of Christ becomes one of the decade beads on the rosary itself. And this point will become important in a minute, as I'll show you. The structure of this manuscript, my final example, once again follows that of a rosary, but in yet a different way. Each opening has a prayer text on the verso and a full-page image on the right. Because the manuscript is in the British Library, I could not afford to pay for all of the images and have only been able to present you with a selection of them. But notice, if you will, that the images have been touched quite vigorously and with a wet finger, so that the blue paint at the top of Christ's head under the frame has liquefied and stuck to the opposite page once the book was closed again. The series begins with a Marian cycle, and as you can see, the user has deliberately touched the images, including kissing the Virgin's blue mantle with a wet finger. Now, there are 5 such images interspersed with text pages. And then, after each group of prayers, the reader encounters an image of the rosary framing the face of Christ. Not only are the decade beads represented as Christ's pierced body parts, but the entire string encircles Christ's head as if he were wearing devotional jewelry with a cruciform pendant. The user has touched the wound systematically and repeatedly touched Christ's face at the center. Copies of this image appear after every 10 scenes of the manuscript, as if the image itself were a decade bead. Here is a detail of that, which shows the degree of abrasion on Christ's face and on the wound images in the decade beads. Another such face appears after the cycle of Christ's adulthood, and another after the Passion, and another after the post-resurrection appearances. And this one is particularly interesting because it, like the other images, has been rubbed, but one wonders whether the votary used her own tears in order to wet the finger and make the blue paint of the Virgin's mantle liquefy, which is why it is rubbed partly down to the parchment. One of the early folios in the manuscript is so worn from use that the letters have largely disappeared, meaning that the user held it out of habit, but could not possibly have been reading the words. So it appears that holding the manuscript and touching it was as important, if not more so, than reading it. Now, finally, I would like to consider 3 ways about thinking about the phenomenon I've been describing. First, that rosary beads were not only created as structures for iterative devotions, but they also provided a framework for a new ritual action, namely touching the beads along the way where the images are treated as beads. Secondly, one could consider the touching of initials as a tactile system for navigating the book's contents, which are continuous with such systems as using protruding tabs for finding one's place. And note in this example, in the Bodleian, that the tabs are velvet, so their pile rewards stroking while you're looking for your spot in the book. Now, the surface of the manuscript can also reward a tactile encounter, where the parchment itself becomes a lacy structure with unusual acoustic and visual qualities and thousands of little edges to finger and flick. Or in the miniature from an East Netherlandish book of Hours, where Abraham gently swings his hammock full of souls against a diaper background, and the user couldn't resist touching the nubbly texture over and over and over until the halo is mushed into the background. But finally, there may be a cognitive reason for treating the images in rosary manuscripts as if they were beads to be fingered. And for this, we turn to a model holding a pencil between her teeth. In a study from 1988 titled Inhibiting and Facilitating Conditions of the Human Smile, a non-obtrusive test of the facial feedback hypothesis, Strack, Martin, and Stepper asked one group of subjects to rate the funniness of cartoons, and then asked a second group to rate the funniness of the same cartoons, but this time while holding a pencil in their hands, and a third group while holding the pencil between their teeth, which forced them into a smiling position. The group with the pencil in their teeth rated the cartoons significantly funnier, apparently because the position of their faces affected their experience of humor. Likewise, the experience of handling beads, especially while kneeling, may have increased the subject's experience of piety. Interacting with the beads, fueling the senses of sound, touch, proprioception, could only have enhanced the subject's engagement. Votaries eagerly consumed all the new rosary devotions, not just because they grounded devotion in the tangible, but because it led to an enhanced emotional or affective response. To carry this physical ritual to depicted beads and manuscripts would have the added benefit of recording the cumulative wear of the user's fingers and therefore of the intensity and duration of her devotion. Now, I want to thank Elizabeth Sandoval for the bead video and Vasily Klucherev for the information about the study of the shaping of faces. And here are the articles I cited. So enjoy your sensory world, and thanks so much for experiencing this video. I look forward to your comments.